If you are stuck on how to elevate your career and your everyday work leaves you feeling exhausted and disappointed, this podcast is for you. You're listening to Work Liberated, the intersection between personal transformation and career empowerment. Listen to industry experts who share valuable advice on dispelling burnout, anxiety, and stress in the workplace through life-changing and innovative strategies. Reconnect with your highest purpose, realign with your core values, and liberate your human spirit by unleashing your full potential in everything you do. Here's your host, Margaret Graziano.
Welcome to Liberated, and today my guest is Alex Howard. Alex and I met at a retreat of sorts about speaking to people and helping people see their true potential, what living in alignment would look like. And I was so impressed with Alex and his work that I invited him to be on the show. So Alex, welcome.
Thank you for having me. Last time we saw each other was in rather different circumstances. So I'm curious to see where we go.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about your business, what you do professionally, and then we'll go into questions Q&A.
Sure. So my origins, maybe we come to spend later, my origins in all of this was I had a complex chronic illness as a teenager, which catalyzed a deep passion for this work. And so originally, I created the organization that I'd wanted to exist in those 7 years that I'd been seriously unwell. So that's the Optimum Health Clinic, and that is one of the world's leading integrative medicine clinics, specializing in fatigue-related conditions, things like ME, chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, alongside also conditions like anxiety, sleep, trauma, and so on. So that was the origins of my business life. I considered myself for many years a therapist by day. So I practiced a methodology called therapeutic coaching, and a business person by night. These days I find myself more of a business person by day sometimes and a therapist by night. And so we also have a company running online conferences called Conscious Life. And so we've had over 1 million people attend our online conferences on things like trauma, anxiety, sleep, fatigue, and so on. And then have a series of online courses and professional training programs, particularly training practitioners in this methodology of therapeutic coaching.
Wow, great. So it's called Optimum?
Yeah, so it's the Optimum Health Clinic.
Okay, thank you. So now you talk about trauma and you talk about anxiety and you talk about stress. And what I'm seeing in the corporate world, so you know, I work on organizational culture and I work with executive teams. I'm seeing a lot of burnout. I'm seeing a lot of frustration. The companies are having a hard time adding staff, but they're not slowing down their initiatives. And so they're piling on more and more on the most capable people, and the most capable people are finding themselves ineffective. So can you speak to that and what is going on and how come these companies don't see what they're doing?
Well, I think there is, as you full well know in your body of work, that there's a culture element here, but there's also, perhaps more from the lens of my body of work, there is an individual level of how people relate to themselves, their bodies, how they relate to other people, and how they relate to the world around them. And a lot of my work over the last 20 years as a clinician has been working with trauma in its many different ways. And I think people typically think about trauma as, big life events like PTSD type trauma, someone being in a war zone or someone having a physical abuse or so on. But those things obviously are traumatic. But the lens of which I look at trauma through is particularly childhood trauma and the sometimes very subtle events that shape our personalities, shape our psychology and the ways that we function. And so to take an oversimplified example of that, you can have someone that grows up learning that your safety in the world and your sense of feeling loved is due to what you do and what you achieve. And that child's parents may love them very dearly, but the way that they demonstrate that love is each time that child performs well or they're top of the class, they notice that they get more of that love. And so that person's, in a way, their trauma or their conditioning is that for me to feel safe in the world, or for me to feel love, I need to constantly be the very best at everything that I do. And so you have individuals where it's not just that they're working hard because they're passionate about the thing that they're doing, but their very sense of psychological safety is tied to them constantly being the very best at what they do. Now, that on the surface is great to an organization. You've got someone that's highly motivated, highly driven. The problem is that many people end up living in a way which is fundamentally unsustainable. And so if every time our body says, stop, I need to rest, and we say, screw you, I've got to achieve this deadline, I've got to do this thing that I said I was going to do, of course, we can get away with that in the short term. But if that becomes the fundamental operating system of how we meet the world, that is unsustainable. There are many different examples. There's particularly 4 or 5 more examples of these types of patterns. So obvious ones being having a helper pattern, that we make the kind of classic people pleasing, making everyone else's needs more important than our own. And if I give to everyone else what they want to need, then I will get the love or the safety or so on that I deserve.
Yes, hold on one second. So you're describing my clients. And I just took a class called Psych K, and it's along the lines of, as an executive coach and as somebody who works with people who are in key roles in the company, I'm always in a training. What else can I learn? But what was interesting about this Psych K class, it was about reprogramming the subconscious. And I've never really done anything with muscle testing. And so it was interesting. But what I found the most fascinating is, and I just got out of a Bruce Lipton Biology of Belief workshop too. So, but what I found most fascinating is both classes, not together, separate, said 95% of our behavior comes from our subconscious programming below 7 years old. And then we show up at work as an executive or as somebody trying to get ahead, and we're like looking for love in all the wrong places, and we don't know we're doing it. So I'd like to know your take on this subconscious programming, and that, you know, they were saying that our behaviors are kind of we're hypnotized prior to 7 years old, like theta brainwaves, and just picking up things, and program is being written by a child. So help me understand, help the audience understand what is going on with this subconscious programming that has us be our worst enemy.
Well, I think one of the things that people sometimes miss is that obviously the environment and the circumstances of our life massively changes as we get older, right? So we go from being a child to being a teenager to being a young adult, and the circumstances and the events are completely different. But the motivations and the things that we're trying to get on an unconscious level is still basically the same. So just like a small child, you know, so I talk about, we all have 3 core emotional needs: the need for boundaries, the ability to say yes and to say no, the need for safety, and the need for love. And these are the same for our emotional health. These things are as important as food, oxygen, and water is for our physical health. It's not that they're nice to have, they are essential to healthy development. And so as a child—
Say them again. Boundaries.
Yeah, so boundaries.
Yes and no.
Safety. So safety being the ability to self-regulate our own nervous system. So as a child, we get safety through our nervous system co-regulating with our caregivers. And so we feel distressed, we are held physically, emotionally, and the calmness in their system teaches our system to be calm. If we get healthy co-regulation as a child, we will naturally be able to self-regulate as an adult.
But if we don't,
if we don't, that's why so many of us end up learning things like meditation and yoga and Tai Chi and Qigong, or in less healthy ways, self-medicate with alcohol or drugs and so on. There are different ways to attempt to bring regulation to our nervous system so we can feel that feeling of safety.
So in a business world where people they're addicted to this thing called the adrenaline bias, That's that anxiety kind of running through. And that's just the way people think it's supposed to be, because that's what they've always had.
Well, the place where this all becomes so challenging, and goes back to the point that you made around these things being unconscious, that to me, the unconscious is not some big mysterious thing that is only accessible through hypnosis. The unconscious is simply the habits and the behaviors that we've normalized and we've automated the running of. And so we can have learned in childhood that we felt unsafe. So what we learned to do when we felt unsafe was our nervous system sped up. And it sped up because in the short term, it's just like, you and I are walking down the street in London, and we don't see the big red electric London bus that's coming towards us. Suddenly we see it, we get a big hit of adrenaline and cortisol, because we need to do one of three things. We could fight the bus. Now, you're tougher than me, but I think I'd rather fight the bus, right? We can fight the bus, we can flight, we can run away as fast as we can, or we can freeze so it doesn't hit us. But whichever of these three things that we do, we need an excess of certain stress hormones like adrenaline, cortisol, and so on. This is the same analogy as thousands of years ago, we're out looking for a woolly mammoth to have for lunch, and the saber-toothed tiger leaps out, and we need that hit of stress hormones. So maybe as a child, it wasn't physical danger, it was psychological danger. We weren't getting our needs met, the world didn't feel safe. Maybe the boundaries we received were unpredictable and inconsistent, and so we had to speed up to deal with that. But then we normalize to being in a hyperadrenalized state. This is what, in my work, I call a maladaptive stress response. It's where we have a healthy stress response that's become maladaptive.
Maladaptive?
Yeah, so a maladaptive stress response.
Okay.
The problem is, to go back to your point, we normalize to being in that state.
Yeah.
And so I can think of many, many times in my clinical career, someone comes in and we sit down at the beginning of a consultation, and perhaps I'll be talking about the importance of nervous system regulation. And that person will say with absolute confidence they don't have a dysregulated nervous system. And yet they're so dysregulated that I'm having to work to regulate my own nervous system just being sat across from them, because they're so adrenalized. But they've normalized to being in that state. And they've also normalized to the coping strategies that they use to self-manage that they have got a cocaine habit because they can't sustain the stress response on their own, so it has to be chemically sustained, or because they can't calm that pattern at the end of the day because they're so used to it that they're using marijuana or they're using alcohol as a way, and they've become so dependent upon these different ways of trying to regulate their nervous system. The problem is that none of those things are sustainably effective. The ultimate thing we need to learn to do is to have better ways to regulate.
Yeah, so it's interesting because it also occurs now, this isn't occurring for me, as I get to know people deeper at these executive levels, many of them wind up eventually sharing that they had some things go on in the household as children, like children of alcoholics, or there was a really sick parent, or they were really sick. There's these hyper achievers, and I am not making a blanket statement. I'm looking and being curious. I notice in my small window of the world, 75% of the hyper achievers I work with are dealing with some kind of trauma that they are now operating on top of and don't know they are. Like for myself, I remember being in Peru in January, and only one other time in the last 3 years did I say, do I have anxiety? But in Peru, there's nothing to do. There's hours on top of hours just sitting there alone if you're doing the work. And I said, oh my God, this sense in my stomach, I've had my whole life. My whole life, I have had a nervous stomach. And I have a child who said to me, Mommy, there's butterflies in my stomach. And like he was feeling it, and he still talks about his anxiety. But I really didn't. I would have been that person sitting across saying, I don't have that. But then if you look at my life and how I've crammed my schedule, yeah, that's the hyperachiever. And so I wonder if most of our companies are being run by people that are operating on top of trauma, not knowing that they've had trauma. And then they're bringing hundreds of people with them on this adrenaline bias.
I haven't met everyone, but I've done over 10,000 hours of clinical consultations. We've had over 1 million people attend our online conferences. We've trained hundreds of practitioners. And the conclusion that I've come to is that everyone that I've met who is a super achiever, every single one of them has a level of unresolved trauma. Doesn't mean that they can't resolve the trauma, but why would someone push themselves constantly beyond their limits, which is what it takes, at least in the short to medium term, to become the best at something? Why would they do that if they are in a healthy state of balance? Now, my point is not that one should therefore just give up any sense of ambition or drive and just sort of go and, sit on a beach in Bali and sort of sing Kumbaya. My point is that there is a healthy and there is an unhealthy expression of an achiever pattern. The unhealthy expression is that we are trying to resolve our unresolved trauma by constantly running, or we have a belief that when we get to a certain destination, and by the way, that destination constantly moves, but when we get to a certain destination, then we're going to feel a certain way. And there's a feeling that we don't have now that we believe that's going to exist at some point in the future. So that's the unhealthy expression. The healthy expression is that we resolve those issues. We do good therapeutic work. We grow our self-awareness. We have tools. We have strategies. We learn how to self-regulate our nervous system in an effective way. We work through the unresolved issues. And then what we're motivated by is we realize that we enjoy excellence. We enjoy challenging ourselves. We enjoy taking on difficult problems and perhaps working with energized teams of people towards those. There is absolutely a way to have a healthy expression of this. The difference is that is sustainable versus the place where we are living in a fundamentally unsustainable way. And, for the last 20 years, running one of the world's largest clinics specializing in fatigue, I can think of, off the top of my head, dozens and dozens of stories. And I know that we have thousands of stories of people that thought that they were immune and thought they could just keep on going, and at some point simply ran out of steam.
Yeah. Well, and that's this chronic fatigue syndrome we're hearing so much about, at least in the States, where people are just getting, or adrenal, what do they call it? Adrenal overload, adrenal failure, or
adrenal fatigue.
They just have to stop. They have to take a leave. The body shuts down. And that's what it seems like happens with a lot of these hyperachievers. They go, and then somebody dies and another person dies, or there's a car accident, or they get sick, and the body is saying, listen, Mr. or Mrs., you need to stop. So I want to get to the third basic need, or the third emotional need. What was that?
So there's boundaries, there's safety, and there's love. And love is that sense of we are loved for who we are, not for what we do and what we achieve. And what many, particularly what hyperachievers learn, is love is hooked on to the certain outcomes and accomplishments and achievements. And when you don't achieve those things, then the love is not there. Now, what's also particularly important, it's not just love from other people, it's also love towards ourselves. And so that sense of self-acceptance, that sense of being at ease and being at peace with ourselves. And this also very much shows up in how we relate to ourselves day to day. Like, for example, our inner critic, that critical voice inside of our mind that we all have that shows up in different ways. And when we have a self-love deficit, when we believe that we have to get to a certain point to then get love, again, it becomes unsustainable. And by the way, it isn't just love in the romantic sense or love in our relationship to ourselves. It's love in terms of being accepted. It's love in terms of feeling like we're a valued part of a team, and we're only valued when we're constantly at the front and we're constantly the person that's winning. My point here is I want to really make sure it's clear that I am anti-ambition or anti-achievement. I'm definitely not. What concerns me is the sustainability of how someone is living their lives. And if we have a sense of self-worth and a sense of inherent lovability, which is the starting point, it's not the destination that we're trying to get to, the way that we then engage in the workplace, the way that we engage in our relationships with other people is then fundamentally changed. Because also, we're not coming from a place where we've got to get a certain outcome to feel a certain way. The way to truly work collaboratively and in harmony and in balance with other people in the workplace is that we already come from a place of feeling good enough as we are. We don't get our sense of value by beating other people or by other people losing or by, whatever it may be. We might still want to be the best at what we do, but it's unhooked from our sense of self-worth, which already is there.
Yes, so there's so many things popping up. I could talk to you for hours about this, but I won't. You also mentioned it's not just the hyperachiever, it's the martyr or the helper, and they show up very differently at work. They're not concerned with achieving, they're concerned with helping. So they overextend themselves. And, as you're talking, I'm like, oh, this is our ideal actual culture. So we do diagnostics with organizations, and what we always ask first, what's the ideal culture? What everybody says they want: high achievement, because you can't really have a company that's not achieving, because then they're not a company. They want self-actualization, which is people can feel like they are their highest and best use of self at work and they're fulfilled. They want humanistic. They want to be treated like a human being. They want people to know them and love them and appreciate them. And then they want affiliation. They want to partner with people. Everything in that ideal is what you just said. Like this is what it is to work in a team. But then we ask a week later, another survey, what do you actually have? And this is really telling. And what winds up happening 95% of the time is they have a polarized work environment where they have defensive aggressive, which is what you're talking about, I have to beat you. So it's unhealthy competition. It's perfectionism. This is the way you do it. And this is the only way you do it. Powering up over, like moving them out of the way, and opposing, like fighting. And so you've got that, but on the other side of the house, you have this extreme passivity, like waiting to be told to do something, or asking for permission, or doing things only to get acceptance, like this crazy need for approval. They're both addictive. And they're both, when they work together, they kind of feed off of each other in the most unhealthy way. So from a mental health, because I feel like that's what you do, emotional and mental health, how do people recognize that they're in this crazy polarization? If they don't hire someone like Keen Alignment, they're just like, oh my God, we have this at our company. Because you see, the defensive aggressive will fight to the end, saying, this is my mojo. You cannot screw with my mojo. Without this, we won't be successful. I even have CEOs that will defend a person or people with that behavior, because they say, without him or her on the team, we're not going to be successful. And it's like, there's so much psychological warfare.
Well, I think, just to speak to that last point to start with, I think that is always a mistake, because I think those people are corrosive. And my observation is that, our philosophy as a business is, yes, we want to hire excellence, but we also hire for the team. And you can have someone that is the best individual performer, which then destroys the culture of a whole department. And that is way more expensive than any additional value that they're going to bring. But in terms of your wider point here, I think, at least on a personal level, to get free of these things, one has to be able to have a level of self-awareness of what's going on in the first place. Because my observation is a lot of the work around mental health is managing the coping strategies that people have created. And so a lot of mental health is around dealing with anxiety or dealing with depression or dealing with addictions. But to me, those things are symptoms, and they're symptoms of these core underlying issues. For example, addiction or anxiety is often a symptom of a dysregulated nervous system. So you can endlessly treat the symptom, or you can go back to the cause and go, why is the nervous system dysregulated, and what are the tools and strategies that person needs to learn to address that? You know, you can focus on depression, or you can look at why is that person's emotional range narrowed. Again, it's often a trauma response. It's that one has gone into emotional overwhelm, hasn't had the holding and resources to deal with it, and so they've done that. And in a way, you know, people do emotionally the same thing that antidepressants do. By the way, antidepressants have their place, and anyone that's taking them shouldn't stop taking them without appropriate medical guidance. But what antidepressants will typically do is they will narrow your emotional range. So you won't have the big lows, but you also won't have the highs. You won't have the joy and the pleasure and the fun. So it levels you out. And if you're emotionally in a place of significant instability, there's a value to that. Can be helpful. That can stabilize people to allow them to engage in other things. But if what's happened is we've effectively frozen our emotions, and so we feel numb, and then we feel depressed, we don't feel the joy and the pleasure in life, we can treat the symptom, or we can explore why. Well, so what's the logical narrative of why that person's system has shut down in the way that it has? And there's many different examples, but maybe one example is that someone has gone through a series of difficult life experiences. Maybe they lost one of their parents in a way that it wasn't easy to process, and there's a lot of grief around that. You know, maybe they went through a relationship breakup, and maybe the relationship breakup had impact on their personal finances, and they're living with the frustrations around that. And there's a lot of feelings around that. There's anger, there's hatred, there's sadness, there's fear. And so as a protective response, one's emotional body has narrowed, and it's frozen, and it shut itself down. Well, in a way, that's really intelligent. Let's go and deal with that. Let's look at how we support that person with that emotional processing so they can start to reopen up their emotional capacity, not just give them more things to numb the numbness. Yeah. And so I think when we're
things to numb the numbness, that's going to be a quote.
So it just, we can come back to the systemic level in a moment, but in a way you're much more qualified than I am to speak to that. But I think when it comes to addressing these things, to me, a lot of the focus is in the wrong place. Just like with a lot of physical symptoms, the focus is too much on managing the symptoms and not looking at underlying causes. I think the same thing happens psycho-emotionally. We look at symptoms and we try and medicate or fix those, as opposed to seeing often those symptoms are intelligent adaptive responses from our mental and emotional body, that actually, if we can deal with the underlying piece, we don't need those adaptive responses in the same way.
Yeah, great. So as you're talking, I'm looking at life like I have this corporate life and all this happening in the business world, and then I'm dating, and I'm thinking that a lot of men and women are dating in this frame. And so they're looking for someone to fill the hole, or looking for someone to be that addictive, like instead of marijuana or Prozac, or like just fill my hole, just fill the hole, just fill the hole. And the part for me as a professional woman and as somebody who's pretty well versed, it's interesting how many people haven't done their work. I'm not upset about it. It's just like, wow, this guy really needs to, I went on a date with a guy, and he's like, well, I lead sex forward. I need to have sex right away to decide if we're going to bond. And I'm thinking,
good luck with that, mate.
Well, it's working for him, but I mean,
it isn't, though, is it? Because he's still dating.
Because he's still dating, right? But he thinks it's working for him. And so I'm the kind of person that I used to coach them. Every guy I would give a free coaching session to, which is another form of addiction. And now I just say, oh, okay, great to know. Thank you. But that's his journey. But there, whether there's people who do that with jobs. There's people who take a new job and quit a job and take a new job and quit a job. And so we've been talking so much about hyperachievers. I do want to talk a little bit about the people who don't achieve at all. Like they have this path and this record of going into companies, doing what they need to do to get the job, or probably what they need to do to get the girl or guy, and then not showing up. Like, what's that about? What's that? Like, I know there's a lot of different things that it's about, but there's got to be a kind of a classic underachiever thing. What's that?
Obviously a bunch of things that can be happening there. I think one of the things is often a self-esteem, self-worth issue. Someone just thinks they're not worthy and they don't want to put in the work to risk having it confirmed that they're not worthy. And so it's better not to try in the first place. I think there's also a pattern that comes in where there's a sort of, going back to, we talked about 3 core emotional needs. One of those needs is boundaries. And so to break that down a little bit more, it's boundaries with other people, but it's also boundaries with ourselves. And so it's that ability to ourselves to say no, or that ability to ourselves to say yes. And so if we didn't get, just like if we didn't get healthy nervous system regulation as a child, it impacts how we are as an adult. The same is true with boundaries. If we didn't get healthy boundaries as a child, we didn't learn how to boundary with ourselves as an adult. Classic example being, if the boundaries we received as a child were too soft, there's a lot of talk about boundaries being too firm and too hard, but boundaries can also be too soft. And so if you look at particularly some of the younger generation coming into the workforce at the moment, one of my observations is that they are the product of parents that grew up with very rigid boundaries.
Yes.
And so what those parents thought was, well, I don't want to give my children a childhood like what I had. And so they do the opposite. They take away the rigidity and the boundaries. And what they basically do is they are at risk of breeding a bunch of self-indulgent narcissists and a bunch of snowflakes that think that the world is there to serve them and doesn't realize when you come into the workplace, you have to earn respect and you have to earn trust and you have to earn your promotions. You have to earn your way. But because they weren't given those boundaries in childhood in the way that they needed, or they may have had boundaries that were so crushing they've just sort of given up their motivation in the first place. It can also go that way. But I think there is particularly a generation that have come into the workplace in the last sort of 5 to 10 years that have been wholly failed by parents and teachers and so on, because part of how you learn motivation is you push against things. And motivation is like a muscle that it grows the more you have to push against things. If you don't get anything to push against because you're just told that everything's great and you're completely fine as you are and your feelings are the most important thing in the world, you don't grow that sense of capacity. So you come to the workplace and you expect everything to happen for you,
Yes.
as opposed to realizing that you have to contribute, you have to earn your way. And if you want to be a valued member of a team, guess what? You need to be of value to the team.
Yeah, this is so good. I have in my book, Ignite Culture, there's a customer, Max. That's not his real name, but I am actually friends with this guy now. And he will love, this portion of this podcast because he's been saying that, but he says it in a way that he's just so aggravated and so agitated rather than having trained himself to find out about this entitlement before you hire somebody. We can find these things out. Just like you can find out about the super aggressive, you can find out about the super passive. But it is interesting because our businesses now are inheriting these people and going, what am I supposed to do? And the more passive the passive are, this is what I find. If we're not good at accountability for others, which a lot of people practice artificial harmony, and it's the two lowest scores on our assessments, self-awareness, 3 lowest scores, self-awareness, self-control, and accountability for others. So what happens is these managers and the executives are terrible with accountability. So they allow it to go, they allow it to go, they allow it to go. This side gets more and more aggressive and more hostile. And then you have this back to that opposing culture. So this is fascinating.
I also want to make clear as well, I'm very deliberate in this framework, right? This boundary, safety, and love. And what you'll find is certain schools and certain approaches will be, in my opinion, imbalanced in the overemphasis of one of these things. So if you look at the sort of more classic sort of Tony Robbins self-development, by the way, Tony Robbins had a massive impact on my life 25 years ago. So I have massive support for much of that work. But it's a very big focus on the boundaries, on the do, on the go, on the make things happen.
He's
You then look,
very hyperachiever.
yeah, and then if you look at the a lot of the mindfulness, yoga, self-development world, a lot of that's around the safety and the self-regulation. Then you look at a lot of the pop psychology world, it's around self-love and self-worth. The problem is, if you go too far in any of these areas, things become out of balance. And so, you know, you need to have that self-regulation and that safety, and you need to have that sense of self-worth and self-love. But if you do those two pieces without the boundaries piece, goes back to my point, what you end up with is self-indulgent narcissistic tendencies that are not coexisting in a space where one also has responsibility. One has to play their part, one has to show up, one has to do hard things. And a lot of the good things in life come from doing the hard things that you have to do along the way to those good things. And so just like to parent children in a truly effective way, you've got to balance these needs. In self-development and one's own inner work, they need to balance these things. Organizations also need to balance these things. And so when you have organizations which are too soft and too loving, you have very frustrated, poor performing teams. But if you have too much of the push, and not enough of the individual care and sensitivity, so you can go out of balance in lots of different ways. And the resolution is rarely just to do the opposite. The resolution is not to go, we're too push, so just don't push at all. It's where is that point of optimizing each of these qualities in a way that actually brings balance, but also brings results.
Yeah, it's the Goldilocks, just right. What I've seen is when I can speak for myself, but I think I'm on the balance track, and I think I've been working on that. But what I see is when one is in it, in that hyperachiever, in that martyr, or that narcissistic, they can't see it. They cannot see it. And so they double down. And that's why we work with entire executive teams. And before we ever do strategy work with them, we do something called a deep alignment, which is let's understand what's under the table here, what's running the show. And there's a lot of like, whoa, we're not supposed to be talking about this stuff at work, but we have to, because it is what's driving. So Alex, you've got a couple things going. I know you have a program. What is the online program that you have running now that people can opt in to learn more and work with you directly? Just give us one that makes sense for the whole world of living in alignment.
Yeah, so I'm going to give two very quick things. So firstly, one of my great passions is storytelling and filmmaking. I have a YouTube series called In Therapy with Alex Howard, where we film people's therapeutic journeys. And so it's the real life capturing of what happens in therapeutic work, and specifically therapeutic work with me. So that's easy to find. In terms of programs, my Reset program is a 12-week online coaching program specifically designed to learn how to meet these three core emotional needs, specifically how to bring balance to your nervous system. How do you learn to self-regulate? How do you learn to build self-love? And how do you do it in a supported, structured way? Everything that I do, people can easily find pathways to, including a free video series on that at my website, alexhoward.com.
And then also we have a free downloadable book. Can you say a little bit about that, and then we'll close? But yeah, before we do, I want to invite myself for you to do a therapy session on me about dating, and we'll film it.
That would be a fun one.
Yeah, I'm totally interested in that. I joined a 12-week intense, it's called Naked Dating, but there's no men that are doing any coaching. It's all women. And it's really about getting real and having boundaries, but I'd love a session with you, and I'll even pay for it, and I'll let you broadcast it. So anyway.
Before we come to I want to tell you a very, very quick, very funny story to help encourage men to come to places that men don't go to for online dating and so on. So about 20 years ago, I got invited to a speed dating event. And I got a free ticket to a speed dating event. So I went to this speed dating event, and at the speed dating event, I met someone that was one of the key co-founders of the Optimum Health Clinic. So for the men out there that think I don't have time to go speed dating, you never know, you might meet a business partner as well. Yeah. However, in moving on to the ebook, so there is a ebook of 12 people's healing stories from complex fatigue. And so often what happens is when we live in an unsustainable way, like that we've been speaking to, our system burns out. And these are stories, yes, they're stories of how these people physically recovered their health, but in a way more relevant to this conversation, the lessons that they learnt along the way about how they brought balance to these types of patterns. And there's some great stories, including one of an undercover policeman here in the UK, who was doing very dangerous undercover work where one of his colleagues was killed on the job. Another one, I think, had a heart attack. It was enormous risk and stress. And I remember in one of the early sessions that we had, and we were doing some parts work around working with the unconscious, and he had pain in his arms. And I said, well, let's talk to the pain in your arms. He looked at me and was like, talk to the pain in my arms. And I remember he left that and he looked back and goes, talk to the pain in my arms? What are you talking about? Anyway, he had a massive turnaround in his health. And there's a very inspiring stories. It's called Secrets to Recovery. And I'm sure you'll give people a link of how people can get access to that.
Great. Thank you, Alex. Howard, this has been so fun. I look forward to seeing you again. And for now, goodbye.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for watching.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Work Liberated. May these nuggets of wisdom from the most inspiring human potential catalysts today guide you in becoming someone who can work exceptionally with others and accomplish goals inside the collective. Continue your journey as a fulfilled and self-actualized person by listening to more episodes at www.workliberated.org. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a positive rating, and share with your friends. That's all for now. See you on the next one.